the judge may well be the most consequential one of my lifetime. It is becoming clearer by the day, at least what the aspirations are of the Trump administration as we see the appointees coming in. And of course, in the election, also the Republican Party captured both the Senate and the House, which means that Trump has certainly a clearer path to some of the policies that he's aspiring to put in place. We'll see how that plays out, to be sure. When I say consequential, if we think about the various policy issues, certainly the ones we work on here at the Corbell School, you take it issue by issue, at least on the face of it, it looks like a pretty sharp break from the past. Immigration, for example, at least rhetorically. And now as we see some of the appointees, it looks like Trump is serious about a fairly mass deportation on scales we've really never seen before. In the security realm, our policies in Ukraine, in question, certainly rhetorically, some of the appointees, at least the people he intends to appoint, Pete Hegseth at Defense and Tulsi Gabbard for as the National Security Director, have had very different points of view about how the extent to which the United States should be supporting Ukraine. In the Middle East, it looks like we'll be, if anything, closer to Israel in the conflicts that are happening there. Certainly rhetorically, quite hawkish on China. So we'll see where that all goes. On trade, Trump has made tariffs a centerpiece of his campaign strategy, and his support, his nomination or suggested nomination of Robert Lighthizer at USTR, a very hawkish person on trade, suggests that we may be in for a period of rising tariffs and possibly even trade war. Climate change, drill, baby, drill was a campaign slogan. We'll see what that looks like in practice. But certainly, if history is a guide, Trump is much less sympathetic to international efforts to rein in carbon emissions. In his last presidency, he withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Accords, for example. And we can go down the list in terms of international development and support for foreign aid in various forms, and certainly in the topic that we've been focused a lot on, support for democracy, which has been really a centerpiece of American foreign policy in some ways for 80 years. I mean, stepping back, if we think over that time period, this looks like something of a break in the tradition that began before the end of the Second World War. The establishment of what's commonly called the global liberal order, promoting democracy, free commerce, and the rule of law in international affairs. Well, we'll see. A lot to talk about. And obviously, we don't yet know for sure what's going to happen. But with us today, three people who are remarkably well positioned to discuss these issues. We'll have conversations with each. Congressman Jason Crow, who represents the Colorado 6th District. Congressman Crow, a veteran, serves on both the Foreign Affairs and the Select Intelligence Committee in the House, and has become one of the leading experts in the Congress on foreign affairs. Kori Schake, who is Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a Washington-based think tank. Kori is really one of the nation's leading commentators on American foreign policy, and we're delighted to have her with us today. And Annika Silver-Leander, who is head for North America at International IDEA, which is a Stockholm-based intergovernmental organization that supports democracy worldwide. So really looking forward to these conversations. I spoke with Congressman Jason Crow in his office earlier this week on Wednesday. I'm joined this morning by Congressman Jason Crow to talk about the impact of the election on American foreign policy. Congressman, first, congratulations on your victory, re-election, representing District 6 in Colorado. I assume a bittersweet evening for you, given the national outcome was disappointing. I should also say I call you Professor Crow as well. Thank you so much for teaching the course for us this spring. It was a huge hit with our students, so really appreciate it. Anyway, thanks for your time. I know that your time's limited, so why don't we jump in? I mean, obviously, elections.
Well, I just want to thank you, Dean Mayer, for having me back, and your leadership and the work at Corbell School, phenomenal. So hello to all the students. You're just remarkable folks. And obviously, I'm happy to be joining you. There's much to talk about.
There is much to talk about, and I know our time's pretty limited. Elections have consequences, and among them, obviously, not only did Trump win, but majorities, Republican majorities in the House, and we're starting to see the proposed appointments of people like Marco Rubio for state, and John Ratcliffe at the CIA, and Mike Waltz at NSA, and Pete Hegseth for defense, which may be the biggest surprise. A lot of rhetoric in the campaign. So now we're beginning to see the contours of the administration, and so we wanted a chance to get your take on that. Let me just start with. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about. Obviously, let me just start with some of the hot spots in the world. Three hot spots maybe: Ukraine, Middle East, China. What's likely to change from the Biden administration to the Trump administration in those three arenas?
Well, I mean, all three of those are obviously very different scenarios with different needs and at different stages of conflict or pre-conflict in the case of one of them. I think a lot could change. I'm deeply troubled by the results of the election. I think that's no surprise. Anyone who knows me and knows my politics and knows that I'm somebody who has committed much of my adult life to the national security of the United States, to building out a robust foreign policy that leads with our values, that leads with the idea that we're strong, not just because we have a strong military, but because we have partners and we have alliances that also work with us and keep us safe. So I'm somebody that believes in developing alliances, leading with our values, utilizing all of the tools in our toolkit, whether that's economic, sanctions, cultural, diplomatic, or military when it's necessary. That's a view that is not shared by Donald Trump, who has repeatedly dealt with isolationist rhetoric, who maligns our partners and our alliances pretty regularly. So I'm concerned about the future of the transatlantic partnership. That's NATO, that's other bilateral and multilateral agreements that represents that transatlantic partnership and the impact that would have on Ukraine. Donald Trump's long affinity for Vladimir Putin in Russia and the involvement of folks like Elon Musk, the world's richest man, who seems to be taking a central role in national security and foreign policy discussions in what is the nascent stages of the soon-to-be Trump administration, and somebody who reportedly has had a lot of interaction with Vladimir Putin. So I'm concerned about all of those things and the implications on our national security, and that would also include the Middle East as well. I think I'm somebody who has long said that the path ultimately to peace in the Middle East has to entail a two-state solution, where the people of Israel and the Palestinians must have the right to self-determination, must have the right to exist, and must be secure. And not until all peoples have the right to have those things will there ultimately be peace. And that's generally not a view that has been shared by Donald Trump and those who surround him and will help shaping and forming his foreign policy.
And what about coming to the third hotspot? And I want to come back in a moment to the general point you're making about alliances and commitment to multilateral institutions and the like. But just on China, because there's so much attention there, there've been some of the appointees and Trump himself have had pretty hawkish statements about China. Do you see, whether in the trade arena or God forbid, in the military arena, changes in terms of our relationship to China?
Well, I think there's going to be potentially a lot of changes, right? You look at Robert Lighthizer as the trade representative, Donald Trump's rhetoric around tariffs. Listen, tariffs are going to increase the cost of living for middle-class Americans, potentially upwards of $4,000 a year of additional cost on middle-class Americans, right? Tariffs historically are a tax on the consumer. That's how they work. That's how they operate historically, and I think we'll see that happening. I think trade wars, given the complex economy and the global trade system, will not have the impact that Donald Trump has said they will have to his voters and on the campaign trail. They'll have consequences that I think we will see very quickly, and that will bite very hard for a lot of Americans. And the other thing about Taiwan, it's one thing to saber rattle and to pound your chest, but the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi, they look very closely at the ability of America to develop and hold alliances. One of the biggest barriers to Chinese aggression is the alliance system. The fact that the United States can bring to bear a vast array of partners to any one situation. And the litmus test for that is Ukraine, right? There are autocrats and leaders around the world who are looking to see whether the United States and the US-led coalition can go the distance in Ukraine. Can America keep its promises? And can it support one of its own, a struggling, growing democracy? If the answer to that is no, if we pull back from our support of Ukraine and allow Vladimir Putin and Russian forces to move in and take, all or part of Ukraine, what that's going to do is set off a cascading effect around the world. It'll lead us into a new era where countries believe they can take by force their neighbors and to reshape boundaries. That is a reality that we have not dealt with since World War II, because we have had a system of rules that has been enforced by the United States and others. And that system could come to an end if Donald Trump follows through on some of his promises.
Yeah, and you're speaking now almost about even more generally about the global order that more or less with bipartisan support over almost 80 years now of multilateral institutions, of certain rule of law in the international arena. Do you see this as a fundamental break from that history of support for what's called often the liberal order, support for democracies, for open trade, for rule of law in the international system, and a retreat back to more of a isolationist policy?
Well, that certainly is what Donald Trump and his closest advisors' rhetoric indicates, right? That is the rhetoric they use. There's that saying that personnel is policy, a Reagan era saying, and Donald Trump appears to be, for the most part, with some exceptions, I will say, for the most part, seems to be surrounding himself with folks that believe in a more isolationist policy. Listen, I think we need to really break this down, because we use all these terms about neoliberalism, rules-based international order, transatlantic partnership, international trade. And a lot of folks around the country just scratch their head and say, oh, wait, but prices are going up. How does this serve me? The middle class is out of reach. It costs a ton more to send my kid to college. This is not working. I understand that frustration, and it's real, right? And it's deep. But what we have to communicate better to folks is that meeting those needs and solving those problems is not inconsistent. In fact, it requires us to engage outside of our borders. right? All of these things are not charity. Like we're not involved in NATO. We don't involve ourselves in these trade agreements and these bilateral alliances because we just feel like it. Because we just want to help people. These are transactional relationships that's in the interest of Americans. It keeps us safe. It makes it cheaper for us to keep us safe. It makes it more effective. It helps secure us against cyber attacks. It helps keep space and our satellite system safe. It helps make sure that Americans, the hundreds of thousands and millions that travel and live around the world every year, are safe and protected. There are endless reasons why these engagements and these relationships matter every day to Americans.
Yeah, I know your time's very limited. I want to bring this closer to home just in the last couple of minutes we have. I know you have votes today. Immigration, very hot rhetoric. Already the appointments that we see for Homeland Security, borders czar, the role of Stephen Miller probably in this. Your district is epicenter for a lot of this. Aurora became a cause during the campaign. Trump was there with a rally. Frankly, and I think we all agree, some misinformation. But what do you see coming in immigration? How deep is this likely to go? What can your constituents expect who live in Aurora and elsewhere?
Well, listen, I'm going to be honest here. I think there are potentially some dark and difficult times ahead on the immigration front. I'm somebody who represents one of the most diverse districts in the nation. Nearly 20% of my constituents were born outside of the United States. Immigrants and refugees from around the world. We are a melting pot in so many ways and a model for integrating folks and giving people a path to a new life. I mean, many of the small businesses in my district are run by immigrants and refugees. These are people who work hard, who grow small businesses, who contribute to our economy. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, and they're fundamental to our way of life. And we are stronger and vibrant because of their presence and because of their hard work. So I will fiercely push back on this rhetoric that immigrants and refugees somehow take away and make life worse for Americans. And Donald Trump repeatedly lies about immigration, and he uses it to demonize people. He uses it to scare, to instill fear in Americans. That's largely unfounded. And that's not to say that most people, including me, want to enforce laws, want to make sure that violent criminals are taken off the street. I will always support taking criminals off the street, whether they have status or don't have status, right? One of our fundamental obligations is to keep families safe. And I will never waver and say that if there's somebody who is dangerous or unsafe, that they should be taken off the street. And if that means they get deported, then that's what needs to happen. If it means that they are sent to prison in the United States, then that is what needs to happen. But that's not what Donald Trump is largely talking about. What he's talking about is a mass deportation of millions of folks, folks who, would love to be given the opportunity to normalize their status and take classes and become American citizens and to follow a process, if that process was given to them. B, who own businesses and work in our economy, right? You want to tank our economy, then remove millions of our essential workers, right? Or get them out of our economic system. That will have terrible economic consequences for us. And third, a lot of these folks have American kids, right? And we can talk about the need for immigration reform, which I believe we need to have. But the reality is these are mixed families in many cases. And it is just immoral and unacceptable to either try to separate families like we saw in the first Trump administration, or to take a young child who's grown up, who's an American citizen, who's grown up and knowing nothing but life in America, and round them up and deport them somewhere that they've never lived and don't even understand and are not even a citizen of whatever country is in question. That's unacceptable. And if that is what the incoming administration intends to do, then I will fiercely resist that.
Well, we could talk about that and lots of other issues at great length. I know you're out of time, and I know you have to go vote. I appreciate your time today. Appreciate your service to Colorado and the nation. Great talking with you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Well, I'm always impressed with Jason Crow. Whatever your politics, he's a very thoughtful and well-informed member of Congress, and it was great to hear his thoughts. Let me now bring in my colleague and partner in all of our democracy work and our democracy programming. That's Professor Nazanin Barma, who is also the director of the Scribner, Doug and Mary Scribner Institute of Public Policy here at the Corbell School, and associate dean of the school. And as I said, my partner in all of the work that we're doing on democracy. So good morning, Naz. Good to see you. Let me turn to you now. You'll have a conversation, I think, initially with Corey Shockey and then with Annika Silva Leander, bringing in perspectives, different perspectives, obviously, perhaps than Jason Crow's. First, as I said in the introduction, a very distinguished commentator, author, a scholar, former government official, quite a CV, Corey Shockey, and then more of an international perspective with Annika Silva Leander. So thank you, Naz, and let me pass the baton to you.
Thanks so much, Fritz. Great conversation between you and Congressman Crow. I'm not sure I could say that I necessarily enjoyed it, but it was very informative. It's a real pleasure to bring into the conversation our good friend and partner, collaborator, Dr. Corey Shockey, who is, as Fritz mentioned, is a senior fellow and director of the Foreign and Defense Policy Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute. As we talk a little bit more, Corey, I'm going to sort of bring in different elements of your incredibly illustrious bio, so I'm not going to spend the limited time that we have reading that off. I wanted to just start off, if you wouldn't mind, by referring to a conversation.
Wait, before you start, you left off something really important in my bio, which is chairman of the Professor Nazanin Barma fan club.
Thank you. It's a very much a mutual admiration society, and I'm really grateful to you for joining us. At short notice, as we mentioned when I reached out to you last, well, maybe it was earlier this week, we had planned a very different conversation for today, and we're grateful that you joined us in the lurch, as it were. You have been talking a lot over the last 10 days, and I wanted to refer to a conversation and educating us all, a conversation you had with Dan Dresner at Foreign Affairs just the day after the election, I believe, talking about sort of what does a Trump 2.0 world look like. And there, your kind of, top line, or at least what Foreign Affairs put as your top line comment, was that we are kind of in for a world where we face the Trump chaos premium. If you could just kind of, lay out what you meant by that, just as a sort of scene setter, and then we can go from there. Thank you.
Sure. What I mean by a chaos premium is that there will be an enormous amount of uncertainty associated with Trump policy. In his first term and since, he is notoriously amenable to the last person he talks to, dictating policy, which evidently is how Matt Gaetz came to be the nominee for Attorney General, because the White House Chief of Staff was out of the room when he was pitched. I think that gives a lot of credit to the White House Chief of Staff in the belief that she would have opposed the nomination, which I think is unproven. But that's exactly the kind of the processes that create predictability and create road testing of ideas in the American government aren't going to be part of a Trump administration, right? Like, he likes the chaos. In addition to just the difficulty and exhaustion of trying to keep things on a reasonable track for the country, there are two big downsides to the chaos premium. And one is that America's friends and allies won't be able to predict what the policy is going to be. So they will not be able to align their efforts in support of what we're doing, which means everything we're going to try and do is going to get more expensive because we're not going to have the natural alignment and support of our allies. And the second reason it's problematic is because our adversaries might not understand what our reactions to things are going to be. And that leaves an enormous swath of space for bad decision but by our adversaries because they don't know what we're going to do in response. So it makes deterrence harder to stick.
Thank you. That's really enlightening, and in fact, it helps me kind of organize several of the questions that I hope to be able to get through here. Taking the friends and allies point, you have worked extensively for many years on NATO. I think I remember having a conversation with you about one of your very first positions in the U.S. government was working at the National Security Council for George W. Bush, and in particular in your role on interagency coordination, working on transforming NATO, building the Allied Command, and working on the NATO response force and so on. This is, I think, one of the kind of biggest and most pressing foreign policy questions that we face today. What will President Trump's position be on NATO, and how will it affect, in particular, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Ukraine's ability and our allies' ability to defend Ukraine?
It's such an important question, and I think it's actually genuinely difficult to answer, and it shouldn't be. It should actually be easy to answer. These are treaty allies of 75 years standing. They are America's closest friends in the world. They are the biggest investors in the American economy. They are the people likeliest to help us if we want to do something anywhere in the world. And they are the people whose values most closely approximate the values of American society. So it should be easy to answer, and it is unfortunately not in a Trump administration. What President Trump is saying is that he is just threatening our friends with abandonment, right? Saying, I don't care what Russia does to any of them if they don't contribute what President Trump deems adequate as a contribution for common defense. How President Trump justifies that is by telling his supporters that this is just him as a canny negotiator and crafty businessman getting Europeans to do more. But what that perspective overlooks is two things. The first is that my experience working with allies, and it goes back even further than you suspect, Nazanin, back to 1990, when Colin Powell, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, hired me to be the NATO desk officer in his staff. What I learned managing coalitions for the 91 Iraq War, for the mid-90s Balkan Wars, for the 2001 Afghan War, for the 2003 Iraq War, is that what the United States gives allies mostly is confidence that they can make brave choices and resist intimidation. And when we threaten our allies with abandonment, President Trump assumes they're going to make the same choices we would want them to make. And I think that's mistaken judgment, because I think what we have already seen with German Chancellor Scholz making the first telephone call to Vladimir Putin that he's made in over 2 years is allies fearing they cannot continue a policy without our support and involvement, already beginning to compromise and let our enemies like Russia have a sphere of influence that compromises the human dignity the independence, and the internationally recognized sovereignty of Ukraine.
Okay.
So the second thing that I think is really problematic about Trump administration ally policy is he underestimates the extent to which the magnetism of American culture and example reduce the cost of everything we want to do, because it feels natural for allies to support us. But if we start running our alliances like an insurance company or a mafia collection racket, it is going to be hard for allied and friendly governments to persuade their public that we're going to do the right thing and they should help us.
With that, Corey, thank you. I think you've answered very eloquently one of the questions in the chat about sort of why would any democratic country want to establish an alliance with the Trump administration and the United States. I want to come back to your your longtime boss and mentor, Colin Powell, distinguished American statesman, very much in the mold of a kind of traditional foreign policy expert, somebody who served in numerous roles in the government. Of course, he was the National Security Advisor under George W. Bush, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then ended his distinguished career as Secretary of State with George W. Bush. I wanted to ask you sort of on the kind of to expand the conversation on the diplomacy side of things in light of your longtime professional relationship with Secretary Powell. Talk a little bit about the war in Gaza and the potential for United States to have a role in ending the war and in any kind of post-conflict agreement. And in addition, a little bit more about just kind of our leadership as Fritz and Congressman Crow were talking about, the rules-based order that the United Nations is one of the linchpins of. If you could reflect on that, I'd much appreciate it.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a very difficult administration for American diplomacy for a couple of reasons. First, the one you alluded to, which is what role do our democratic and human rights values play in American policy? It is always difficult to make trade-offs between our interests and our values. And it always feels tawdry and unseemly when we compromise our values because our interests demand it. I mean, think of Franklin Roosevelt having to ally with Stalin during World War II, while Stalin's depredations were obvious. I don't think a Trump administration actually believes America has values that are important and that should weigh heavily in our foreign and national security policy decisions. I think you see that with the pardoning of military who had been convicted of war crimes by courts martial. I think you see it in the blithe way he talks about abandoning American friends. I think that a Trump administration will have no concern for the human dignity of Palestinians. And so I think that's going to be very tough. I think that to the extent the Biden administration placed any restraints on Israeli conduct of the wars, those will be removed in a Trump administration. The second reason I think the question is such an important one is that the United States gets a lot of help by the international institutions we created. And we created them as an early warning network of growing dangers in the international order. You know, the hard men who built the liberal international order, it wasn't like a faculty lounge conversation at a major university. It was the people who'd had to fight World War I and World War II I mean, Ernest King, the chief of the Navy in World War II, had fought in the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. They wanted to build an international order with a greater margin of error, and institutions for international cooperation were the port of first resort in doing that. And they're frustrating to negotiate and navigate, but they are way better than the alternative of not having them, because the world gets more dangerous, you solve fewer problems, and you have less help. The other thing I will say that I think is likely coming in a Trump administration, and that we have already seen before they even take office, right? So Senator Rubio has been nominated to be Secretary of State, but Elon Musk is the one on telephone calls with foreign leaders and the president-elect, and he's meeting with Iran's ambassador to the United Nations. This is going to be sloppy. People who are supposed to have responsibility for outcomes and who are accountable not just to the president, but to the Congress for their choices are going to have a whole lot of people parachuting in, ostensibly speaking for the president, and who will be treated by foreign leaders as though they are representatives of the president.
You know, in a sense, we've flipped to just as I was hoping we would, to the adversary side of your kind of you know, the initial kind of landscape that you laid out here. Fritz and Congressman Crow chatted briefly about China in the context, in particular, of the appointment of Robert Lighthizer and the clear signal that there are going to be serious tariffs imposed bilaterally. I sort of feel like, and perhaps this is a sort of a biased perspective just in terms of kind of what I've been reading, but China has been not in the news and the discourse that much of late. Whereas when you think about sort of the end of the first Trump administration, the beginning of the Biden administration, that was much more kind of a core focus. Of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza has kind of taken over the headlines. I do think that we're going to be hearing a lot more about China in the next few months and over the next few years. Help us understand what that kind of bilateral relationship is going to look like, and crucially, how too that's going to affect the global political economic order.
So President Trump is clearly committed to 10% tariffs on everything imported to the United States and much higher tariffs on Chinese imports.
Yeah.
And in addition to the fact that that demonstrates he couldn't pass Econ 101 at the University of Denver, but it also is innocent of consideration about how others are going to put tariffs on American products. And it's innocent of recognition that most of what the United States imports aren't finished goods. It's ingredients to things that American manufacturing makes. One of the reasons tariffs are going to be such a difficult issue is that the president has pretty wide latitude to impose them by executive order. And I think we're likely to see that early and big in a Trump administration. And the president's even talking about eliminating income taxes and believing that tariffs can supplant that income for the United States government, which is, glitter and unicorns. But that would require congressional legislation in both houses that I think is unlikely to be forthcoming, because there are at least some people in the Congress who could pass Econ 101 at the University of Denver. The Chinese, I think, are, at least indications so far suggest that the Chinese are likely not to retaliate right away. That they are, it may actually be in Xi Jinping's interest to have the the segregation of Chinese and American economies. It looks like that's what he's going for as well, if only to be able to protect the Chinese economy from American sanctions. And so President Trump is likely to think it beneficial. American businesses are unlikely to think it beneficial. And so I think what we will see is civil society at work as businesses and consumer groups press Congress to rein in a president of the Congress's party.
There've been a couple of questions in the chat about sort of potential checks and balances, and I think it's really important to recognize, as you've just articulated, the difference between the things that the administration can do via executive order versus what would require kind of legislative action, and to remember that there are still some guardrails that we hope will hold. Sort of in a follow-up question, you noted Xi Jinping has been actively, and thank you for reminding us of that, kind of trying to decouple the Chinese and American economies for the last few years. And in a sense, the effects of the COVID pandemic on the Chinese economy have sort of aided in that attempt. Do you think this, and this is a difficult question, you don't have a crystal ball, perhaps you do, does this increase the chances of Chinese action in the Taiwan Straits and the potential invasion of Taiwan?
Yes, I think it does, because political scientists and historians argue a lot over whether economic interdependence increases or decreases the likelihood of interstate war. It does seem to me that the record of the last 10 years at least has been that both China and the United States have been more careful with each other, because neither of us want to provoke the economic turmoil that conflict would bring. There may be different reasons for why they want to avoid it, but we have both wanted to avoid it. And if that separation of the economies becomes inevitable or appears occurring, I think there is less restraint on China's ability to carry out its stated policy of aggression towards Taiwan. The other thing is that I think the tough talk on China hasn't progressed far enough to explore the truly chokehold areas of American reliance on China. And let me just give you the one that always springs to mind for me. A lot of Americans take heart medication, and that medication is fundamentally reliant on chemical inputs and manufacturing in China. And if I were the Chinese National Security Advisor, I would make sure that we would choke that off in any conflict with the United States. And that's going to hurt a lot of Americans. So we haven't done the groundwork of getting ready for the kind of tough policies that we're talking about.
I think what you're describing is the concept of weaponized interdependence that our friends Abe Newman and Henry Farrell have written about. The recognition that as much as the United States has leverage on its bilateral partners in the global economy, so too do those partners on us, and very important to remember that. Corey, you've been peppering in throughout the conversation, as you always do, such wonderful kind of historical insight based on your long-term research, the many books that you've written, reflecting on the passage of hegemony from the United Kingdom to the United States and so on. I'm going to ask one of our colleagues, if they would, to please pop your really illustrious bio in the chat so that people can refer to some of those books if they're interested in looking further at some of the things you've said. I want to talk about one of the most recent books, I think, that you've written or co-edited, in which your co-editor was Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. As we've all been reminded recently, Jim Mattis, as early as 2000, denounced Donald Trump as a threat to the United States Constitution. And more recently, we've learned from Bob Woodward in his new book that in his conversations with Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, agreed that Donald Trump is a uniquely dangerous threat to the country, to the United States, and to democracy around the world. I want to sort of pair that with the knowledge that we now have of Donald Trump's nominee to be the next Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. And ask you, again, a really tough question about civil-military relations and sort of what the direction of the U.S. Department of Defense sort of portends for us, both in the world, but also, and there's a wonderful question in the chat about this, about civil-military relations here at home and the role of the U.S. military as an apolitical force, a neutral force. Trump has, during the campaign, talked in different ways about using the United States military, the National Guard, here at home against U.S. citizens. A lot of very kind of troubling elements that you could respond to in your answer.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. And I'm especially primed on this one because I just finished writing a book on the history of American civil-military relations. And there has never been a military force as proficient, as influenced in policy, and as comfortably domesticated, subordinate to civilian control as is the American military. It is a thing to be profoundly grateful for as Americans. And we should be profoundly grateful that the American military is trying to keep it that way. The people who are not trying to keep it that way, though, as you rightly point out, are Donald Trump, are Pete Hegseth, right? And many Americans want to pull our military into domestic politics and culture wars. And that will be bad for our country because you will not want a military whose views on Supreme Court nominations or abortion or any of the issues that we properly fight about as Americans in a political context. The American public begins to think of our military the way they think of the Supreme Court, that when they make decisions consistent with my politics, they're apolitical. But when they make decisions inconsistent with my politics, I view them as political actors. That is fundamentally not accurate. And encouraging them, the interesting thing in the data, comes out of Peter Fever's work, that when the military appears to be acting politically, as it very often did in the form of Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the public respects the military less, even if they come down on the politically preferred side of those Americans. So it's not a good thing for the public to lose respect for the people empowered by us to use violence on our behalf. And there's a real danger that President Trump will want to use the American military domestically. He wanted to do it in the summer of 2020 during the social justice protests. And what he wanted to do then was invoke the Insurrection Act.
Yep.
Since 1878, it has been illegal for the President of the United States to use the American military for domestic law enforcement unless the president invokes the Insurrection Act. And that's one of the real bellwethers we should all be watching, because under the Insurrection Act, the President of the United States has enormously wide latitude to use the military against the American people. And that's a genuine risk in a Trump administration.
Let's hope that we go another 150 odd years without having to see that invoked. Corey, I know you just have a couple of minutes here. I wanted to ask you, perhaps as a a little bit of a silver lining, to tell us a little bit about your work. We were just chatting, when we joined the webinar, about your work on Protect Democracy, the group that you've been working with for the last 18 months or so, in particular thinking about some of those checks and balances and guardrails that the American legal system and the rule of law still has in place.
Well, I cannot say enough good about Ian Bassin, the founder and leader of Protect Democracy, and all of the really wonderful people, lawyers across the country, who have worked to strengthen the protections of free and fair elections in our country, to ensure and increase public confidence that our elections are free and fair, to sue people who wrongly attest that poll workers, for example, are not counting ballots accurately. Because, I have always loved Justice Brandeis's comment that sunlight is the best infectant. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And increasing the public transparency about just how strong and stable and reliable elections are in the United States is really important for encouraging people to vote, for holding public officials and average Americans accountable for their behavior around our elections, to ensure that every person who should have the ability to vote can vote, to ensure that people who do not have the ability to vote cannot vote, and to ensure that votes are properly and accounted for.
Corey, thank you so much. As always, you've done a tremendous job of sharing your wisdom with us, your experience, and a sobering conversation. But I always enjoy talking with you. And I'm going to ask Fritz to join us again, just to join me in thanking you for being such a wonderful friend and partner of the Korbel School.
Thank you for being such a wonderful lighthouse and a scholar I learned so much from, Nazanin.
Well, and thank you so much, Corey. That was, as always, I learned so much listening to you. Such a lucid and sophisticated take, informed by history and all the experience you have. So thank you so much for being with us today, and our partnership on so many other things. We really appreciate it.
It was a great pleasure, my friends.
All the best, Corey.
Well, that was fabulous. Thank you. Great conversation. Corey is fantastic. Now I think we turn to conversation. Again, you'll lead, Naz, with Annika Silva Leander, who now joins us. And so we're really delighted to have you with us today. And a bit perhaps of a perspective. I know you're based in Washington, but certainly International IDEA is an intergovernmental organization, as I said earlier, based in Europe and in Sweden, to give us a bit of a take, I think, on how the world is viewing this election. So thank you so much for being with us. And let me turn again to Naz to lead the discussion.
Annika, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure. I've never had the pleasure of meeting you before. Thank you. Really appreciate you being here. I'm going to say just a little bit more about your bio so that our audience sort of knows, the expertise that you're bringing to the conversation. As Fritz just mentioned, you're the head of North America at International IDEA. You oversee International IDEA's outreach in the region, including relations with U.S. government agencies and democracy assistance organizations and academic institutions, as well as engagement with the United Nations. And so I wanted to take advantage of your, kind of multi-layered expertise to kind of reframe the conversation a little bit away from the United States specifically and U.S. foreign policy, but more to sort of the global picture. If I may, I'd like to kind of just refer to a piece that I think has been doing the rounds in the last 10 days or so. I think I first saw it in the Financial Times with the title of The U.S. Election Joins 2024's Graveyard of incumbents. And the reflection there is that of the 10 major countries that have been sort of holding elections for over 150 years, it is the first time in that time that the countries that all held elections this year, the incumbents lost. And I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit about sort of what that means in terms of the global democratic landscape. Let's start there, and then we can kind of pick up on a couple of the threads from that perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for inviting me, and happy to be part of this important conversation. Indeed, this was a super cycle election year, as we all know, and it's coming to an end now. More than 70 elections of different kinds all over the world, both in major geopolitical powers such as India and the United States that also have large population size, but everything ranging from small microstates like Tuvalu that has 11,000 inhabitants. And indeed, one of the trends that we have seen during this year is that many incumbent governments have lost in these elections. And the United States confirms and aligns with that global trend. And I think it has to do to a large extent with in the United States, with grievances and concerns about the economy, and you can see those concerns as well repeated in a number of European countries also that have suffered as a result of the consequences of the pandemic and inflationary pressures and so on. The US aligns with that trend. Should say, however, if we look at the super cycle election year, there are also countries where you have seen powers and governments being re-elected. Even though they're less than the incumbent losses, there are cases. And of course, also a lot of around 18% of the elections that happened this year happened in autocracies. In all of those cases, the elections were not democratic and fair and free in any way, but those elections reinforced the power of those autocracies. But even in hybrid regimes that still hold a veneer of democracy, and some of which are very popular and enjoy support of the electorate, for example, in El Salvador, also were re-elected. And in those contexts, there was often a shrinking civic space and shrinking space for free media, very unfair competition for opposition parties. We see a similar situation in Georgia. So just to note the nuances of what happened during this super cycle election year, indeed, there were a lot of incumbents that lost, and the majority of them, but there were also a lot of governments that were less democratic or outright autocratic that reinforced their hold on power.
Thank you for the important reminder that, in fact, the majority of elections perhaps around the world today happen in hybrid and competitive authoritarian regimes. And in authoritarian regimes, it's a really important thing for us to remember. I like the phrase, the super cycle election year. I hadn't heard that one before. It has been a very busy year. I'm sure you're exhausted, but there's so much work sort of still to be done. I wanted to, come back to something, again, that you're kind of rightly reminding us, which is that even in the elections in democracies, the results sort of haven't moved necessarily in the same direction, right? So of course, here in the United States, the country has re-elected Donald Trump to serve in his second term on the basis of the economic grievances in many regards, as you were suggesting. On the other hand, in India, President Modi's BJP was dealt, they were re-elected, but they were, sort of dealt a surprising setback in terms of the majority in parliament. in the French elections as well, the kind of the more right-wing populist driven party, the National Front, led by Marine Le Pen, was also dealt a setback in local elections. And so there's a way in which even though these elections have been anti-incumbent, they have not necessarily all rewarded populist right-wing governments. And so would love to hear you reflect a little bit on that in terms of some of the kind of more specific stories that you've seen emerging with regard to economic grievance and the results that has put in place in particular.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you see these various trends. I mean, in Europe, you have seen a reinforcement and increase in right-wing populism in a number of countries. You have also seen places where populist parties have gone back. In my own country, Sweden, for the EU parliamentary elections, the extreme right-wing party actually lost. But I think that the tendency in Europe has been from the EU parliamentary election definitely a shift towards the right, with an increase in support for right-wing populist parties. And let's not forget that populism exists both on the right and on the left, and you can see left-wing populists also in some countries in Europe and in Latin America. However, as long as elections are somewhat free and fair, even if the level playing field for opposition candidates and for the media, for a free media, has been limited in places such as India. The fact that India still conducts election, it has an electoral commission that is independent from the executive. It has a judicial system that, even though it has been under pressure in recent years, still holds independence from the executive. And so those factors combined with a pressured civil society, but nonetheless still a vibrant civil society, ensured or led to what we saw in India, which is a loss for the BJP party, a loss of its strong majority, and it still holds a majority and still in government, but it lost the super majority that it had. And I think that should give us a sense of hope that as long as these countries where we've seen democratic backsliding in recent years, as long as they keep holding free and fair elections, even under a lot of strain, but as long as they continue to have independent countervailing institutions such as independent electoral commissions and independent judiciaries, there is still room for the opposition to to gain power or and to counteract the authoritarian tendencies that we may see. And the judiciary has played a key role in a number of countries this year and last year, for example. And so I really want to emphasize the very strong importance of independent judiciaries in a number of contexts. In Senegal, for example, where we saw attempts of the previous president to maintain himself in power, to obstruct the current president from running. The judiciary came in and played a key role in ensuring that the opposition candidate was allowed to run, and resulting in the election of the youngest president in Africa being elected in Senegal. Guatemala, similarly, the judiciary there played a key role where there was a lot of obstruction for the current president to compete in the elections and for the results to be recognized. And the judiciary came in and played a key role to make sure that the results of the elections were respected and that he was able to accede to power. So very key in those contexts that not just the elections are free and fair, but that there are independent institutions that really can ensure that that they are.
Thank you for pointing out those bright spots in terms of free and fair outcomes, and in particular the role that, as you said, the judiciary and other institutional checks and balances like the Electoral Commission in India and so on have played in defending democracy around the world. Help us understand, from your work in democracy assistance and democracy promotion, the role that the international community also plays in bolstering those checks and balances and civil society in their attempts to safeguard democracy. And in as far as the United States has been an important sort of actor in that democracy promotion agenda around the world, thoughts on what the election of Donald Trump might portend for democracy promotion writ large?
I think it remains to be seen how the incoming administration will approach democracy promotion under Trump. And I think we will be closely observing how that unfolds. The nomination of Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State gives us in the democracy assistance community hope that there will be some continuity with regards to democracy assistance support on the part of the US. He has been a strong promoter of democracy globally and human rights, and a strong advocate against autocratic regimes such as China and Venezuela and Nicaragua and others. But of course, he's not the only one who determines democracy assistance, U.S. democracy assistance. The Congress also has a key role in the funding aspect of it. So our hope is that the U.S. will continue to be a strong supporter of democracy globally. But we also know that President-elect Trump is skeptical to multilateral institutions that play a key role in supporting democracy around the world, and that he's also very focused in his foreign policy outlook on economic issues, and very domestically focused, and wants to ensure that resources are targeted domestically, posing concerns. We talked before about concerns about a reduction in aid, in foreign aid in general, and to Ukraine in particular. And certainly if the US both withdraws from multilateral engagement in multilateral institutions and reduces its foreign aid, both development assistance, democracy assistance, and its military aid to Ukraine, that will have a huge impact on democracy around the world. It will first of all put a much larger burden on the EU to take on that responsibility. And if they have more defense spending to incur because of reduced spending, US spending on Ukraine, they will likely also reduce their funding for democracy assistance. And all of that will have huge consequences for civil society around the world, which in many constrained contexts play a key role in checking government power, and that often are very reliant on foreign aid. So that will have huge consequences. Also for free media, foreign assistance plays a key role in supporting free and vibrant media in a number of different contexts. But we'll wait to see what the stance of the new administration will be. Yeah. We hope that the US will continue to play a strong role in democracy assistance.
Yeah. I really appreciate you linking the democracy promotion, foreign aid, security assistance, military assistance agendas. And indeed, that is how the United States and its kind of diplomacy and defense kind of posture has really kind of advanced many of these things together. And as you said, that the partnership between the EU and the United States, European countries and the United States, has been crucial in all those regards, particularly in terms of the potential outcome in Ukraine. You also mentioned, just in the final moment there, the role that democracy assistance and foreign aid plays with regard to the media and the strength of kind of an independent media, and the role that has to play say, in combating misinformation and disinformation in the electoral process around the world. What do you see as the trends, the kind of concerning trends with regard to misinformation and disinformation, and the ability that that we have as the international community, international idea, your partners, to try to combat the role of misinformation as it affects democracy?
Well, that's a
Small
complex
question.
It has a lot of ramifications. I mean, yes, disinformation is a grave threat to democracy around the world, and it's very important to combat it. And all of us engaged in the democracy assistance space are very actively engaged in combating disinformation, which has both a domestic element and often a foreign interference element that interplay. It's very important to recognize that interplay between domestic forces and tendencies, and how foreign interference can play into those and amplify those domestic tendencies.
Yeah.
Very important not to view them as separate phenomena, because then you won't be able to tackle the challenges effectively. The EU, for example, has a very strong focus on fighting disinformation, and the new Commission coming in now is promoting this initiative called the Democracy Shield, where fighting disinformation is going to be a key element, and the foreign interference angle there plays a key role. And importantly, the Democracy Shield focuses on the key interlinkages between disinformation, foreign interference when it comes to disinformation around electoral processes, but not only, and the linkage and the threats that presents to national security issues. Of course, Russia being a major player in the disinformation space, and being such a close threat to European security. But we know, of course, that there are a lot of other foreign actors, Iran, China, and other hostile nations that engage in that space. So very important for all of us in the democracy space to continue supporting both those tendencies of foreign interference, but also supporting more resilience to disinformation in countries, bolstering both independent media, local media in a number of countries, and that's also very important here in the United States, where you have seen a clear decline in local media. Also, media literacy and civic education, key long-term efforts to counter disinformation. And there, again, we hope that the US will continue to play a key role in funding efforts to fight disinformation and foreign interference. A reduction in that area, which we are likely to see, and which we've already seen tendencies of here in the United States, will create vulnerabilities for the world. Then, of course, there's a whole element of the social media platforms, which plays into all of this. And this unprecedented phenomenon that now we have one of the major social media platforms that is owned by Elon Musk, that also has played an unprecedented active role in the campaign of Donald Trump. And as was pointed out also earlier in the conversation, that not only did he play a very active role in the campaign, but also now will play an active role in the administration, and already starting to take on responsibilities outside of his area of responsibility that now has been assigned to him, to think through the restructuring of the American bureaucracy, but also engaging in discussions on foreign policy issues before the administration even has been inaugurated. So the conflict of interest that poses and the dangers that poses for the spread of information is key. I think X is not the only platform, of course, and therefore even more pressure on the other platforms to play a counterbalance and provide alternative spaces. There, the concern that we have in the democracy space is, of course, that many of the other platforms as well have reduced their fact-checking capacities over the past year, which has reduced their capacity to counter disinformation. So hopefully they can step up those efforts and also provide alternative spaces to where impartial, more transparent algorithms and so on facilitate public conversations.
Yeah. I mean, you just touching the surface there, and I know you have so much more to say on this issue, but it is a very difficult, complicated terrain, as you clearly outlined, with the particular role of sort of key figures like Elon Musk that they play in this. This is sort of about the consolidation of global media and the role that sort of business and politics kind of have intertwined. Of course, Elon Musk's on the side of the Defense Department, his Starlink, the role that Elon Musk's satellite technology plays in Ukraine as well. Very kind of multi-layered, complicated picture there. I'm like I did with Corey, I'd like to ask you just in the last few minutes that we have here to kind of turn our collective attention sort of back to the diplomatic arena. And I know that you've worked considerably with the United Nations and your role at International IDEA. I believe you were one of the co-authors on a report, an International IDEA report entitled "Who's Defending Democracy at the United Nations?" And would love to hear you talk a little bit about, the answer to that question. What role will the United Nations play as a forum in which democratic values are advanced and defended? And as you answer that question, in the habit of asking you easy questions, I'll also ask you to reflect, as much as you feel comfortable, on the conflict in Gaza and the role that the UN can play there, and any sort of things that you foresee in that space.
Yeah, on the UN and more generally the role of the UN in advancing and strengthening democracy, the UN over the past few years has become increasingly polarized, and democracy has become a divider in many ways in the UN. And this goes hand in hand with the rise of authoritarianism and democratic backsliding around the world. There are more countries that are leaning towards authoritarianism, and there are less democracies around the world and less democratic voices around the world. And those tendencies are reflected in the UN, since it's a global institution with 193 member states. And so what we did, the report that we put out looks at how countries frame their democracy discourse at the UN, and how that discourse has evolved over the past decade. We were actually surprised to see that democracy is a salient narrative at the UN, and that the concept of democracy is not just promoted by democracies or Western democracies, because the narrative at the UN has often been that democracy is a Western concept that is imposed by the West on a global majority countries. And we were surprised to see that they were actually even more democracies in Asia and Africa and Latin America that really emphasize democracy in their narrative, even more than European countries, for example. Often what we saw is that countries, new democracies, fragile democracies, countries where democracy has been under threat recently, or that have recently transitioned to democracy where the authoritarian past remains very present, were those that refer to the democracy the most, because they don't take democracy for granted. And of course, European countries and the United States also strong proponents of democracy have been historically in the UN, but we were surprised to see that there were a lot of countries also in other regions that are strong proponents of democracy and paint themselves as proud democracies in the UN context. The US, it was in our calculations, the second country after Chile that mentioned democracy the most. So the US has been one of the strongest advocates for democracy at the UN, with a dip between 2017 and 2021. But nonetheless, the country with the most democracy mentions after Chile. How that will play out going forward, of course, we don't know. But of course, the US having been such a strong proponent of democracy in the past and such a strong voice for democracy at the UN, we hope that that will continue to be the case. But we don't know if that will play out. The UN permanent representative for the US that has just been nominated by Trump, Elise Stefanik, she has been skeptical of the UN, but she is a strong proponent of democracy. She sits on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. So that also gives us some hope that that the US will continue to be a strong proponent of democracy in the multilateral space that the UN General Assembly provides.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I hadn't realized, and you put it sort of so eloquently, the fact that democracy has become this sort of dividing or polarizing aspect in the United Nations. But I think that, the bright spot that I appreciate you kind of mentioning there is the pride in democracy that the newer democracies have taken, and their sort of desire to defend their newly earned, privileges and freedoms. I appreciate throughout the conversation you have emphasized that, that perhaps the overall landscape is worrying, but there are always bright spots and things to look for to give us hope in defending democracy moving forward. And I'd like to end just with one last sort of brief question to you. Great question from the chat, sort of, what can we as individual citizens do to safeguard democracy, both at home and around the world?
Since the elections just passed here in the United States, and since this was a super cycle election year, I would say vote, always vote, use your right to vote. And if you live in places where you have that right in an unrestricted way, use it. And especially young people that in a number of contexts feel maybe that democratic politics is not for them, or that it doesn't present alternatives that are attractive to them, that would rather advocate for issues or go out on the streets. The electoral channel is still a key pillar of democratic systems and societies. And so I would say that is very important to continue to use your right to vote. That is not to say that there aren't other forms of active political and civic engagement that people can use, and elections are periodic, but there are a lot of things that you can do in between elections, of course, to engage in civil society. You can engage in global issues, you can engage in local issues. And what I've been hearing a lot now here in the US in the past week is that a lot of people may engage less on national issues where they feel that they might have less of a voice, but they will focus their attention on local issues. I think that whatever level you decide to engage on, because we all can make a difference in small or big ways. But that civic engagement is really important. And I would say here in the United States, I mean, we look at the global state of democracy. We have the Global State of Democracy Indices, which is an index of democratic quality that covers 173 countries in the world. One of the things that gives me hope is that the dimension of participation, which is both civic engagement and civil society engagement and participation in elections, is one of the pillars of democracy globally that has seen the least declines. It has seen declines, but it has seen less declines than in other areas. And in the United States, actually, we have seen over the past decade a decline in a number of democratic indicators and a debilitation of American democracy. But the participation dimension of American democracy is the strongest and one of the strongest in the world. Actually, the US ranks 8th on the participation dimension. And it's the only indicator of democracy that hasn't declined over the past 10 years in the US. So keep engaged at whatever level you feel comfortable engaging in.
Wonderful. Thank you for that kind of, hopeful and inspiring reminder that participation is absolutely, the central pillar of democracy. Annika, we're so grateful to you for joining us here at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies. We're indeed, picking up on your final point, we engage with the great issues of the world from a global to local level. We have many different arenas in which we can exercise our rights and responsibilities. I'm very grateful to you for reminding us of that. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks.
I'm just going to take the last few minutes here to apologize on behalf of Fritz. He had to leave, unfortunately, for a quick family matter. I'm just going to wrap up in just 30 seconds here by reminding everyone that these fall sessions that we've been hosting, and thank you all so much for joining us for these conversations, have been really in aid of getting us ready for our big event, which is our 4th annual Denver Democracy Summit that is going to be held on January 23rd and 24th. It'll be a virtual summit, so you'll have the ability to engage with us online as you have been doing over the last few months. It is the week, those of you who are paying attention will realize, of the inauguration, the second inauguration of Donald Trump on January 20th. So there's going to be a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss. Please click the link in the chat that our team has put up there for you to register for the event. We will soon be announcing our keynote presentations and our panels on critical topics, but you can be sure that we will be covering the kinds of things that we've been discussing over the last 3 webinars: the role of misinformation and disinformation, the potential of artificial intelligence and technology to affect democratic outcomes, and really kind of taking another swing at the crucial question of democratic outcomes here in the United States and around the world. We will look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much again to all of our partners for their support, and to all of you for your engagement, which, as Annika just reminded us, really is the central pillar of our democracy. Goodbye from the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies.